On her 8th birthday, a poor little girl whispered she had never had a birthday cake. A billionaire walking past heard those words and stopped. One simple choice that night didn't just buy a cake. It quietly changed 2 lives and created a ripple of kindness that would last for decades. On the night she turned 8, Leora Wren stood outside Velvet Crumb Bakery, with both hands pressed against the cold glass, as if warmth might travel through it if she stayed still long enough. Inside, the world looked unreal. Golden lights poured over rows of perfect cakes, silky chocolate towers, white buttercream roses, glossy strawberries, pastel layers trimmed with sugar stars. Everything inside the shop looked soft, bright, and wanted. Outside, the sidewalk was wet, the wind sharp, and Leora's thin cardigan did almost nothing to keep out the chill. Beside her, her mother Maren Wren crouched down on the cracked pavement. At 31, Maren already looked older in certain light. Her faded jacket smelled faintly of diner coffee and cleaning soap, the scent of too many shifts and too little rest. She brushed a loose strand of hair from Leora's cheek and tried to smile, but exhaustion trembled at the edges of it. "I know, sweetheart," she whispered. Leora nodded quickly, giving the brave little smile children wear when they want to protect the adults they love. "It's okay, Mom," she said softly. "We need the rent more." The words were too practiced, too calm for an 8-year-old. That was what hurt most. Cars swept past behind them, spraying mist across the curb. A bus groaned to a stop at the corner, then pulled away again. But Leora barely heard any of it. Her eyes stayed fixed on a small ivory cake in the center of the display, decorated with tiny blush-colored stars and 8 empty spaces waiting for candles. She swallowed hard. Then, before she could stop herself, she whispered the truth that had been sitting inside her chest all day like a bruise. "I've never had a birthday cake before." Maren's face fell, and a few steps behind them, beneath the bakery awning, a man in a dark coat stopped walking. The man beneath the awning did not belong to this street, at least not at first glance. His coat was dark wool, sharply cut. His shoes were clean despite the rain. Everything about him carried the quiet precision of someone used to being obeyed without raising his voice. Silas Vale, 36, founder of one of the most powerful tech companies in the country, had spent years building a life so polished it almost erased the boy he used to be. To the world, he was controlled, brilliant, unreachable. A billionaire with a calendar full of private dinners, investor calls, and rooms where nobody ever said no. But one sentence from a little girl broke through all of that. "I've never had a birthday cake before." Silas froze. For one strange, brutal second, the city around him dissolved. He was no longer standing outside Velvet Crumb in a tailored coat, with a driver waiting somewhere down the block. He was 8 again, standing in a dim apartment kitchen, while his mother cried quietly at the sink, still wearing her diner uniform. He remembered the ache of that birthday, the silence, the humiliation of pretending he didn't care. His father had already left by then. Money had been thin. Hope had been thinner. And then he remembered the knock at the door. A neighbor had appeared holding a cheap grocery store cake with crooked frosting and candles that refused to stand straight. It had not been beautiful. It had not been elegant. But to a boy who felt forgotten, it had felt like rescue. Silas looked again at the little girl outside the bakery window, at her worn sleeves, at her careful posture, at the exhausted mother trying to stay strong beside her. He could have walked away. That was what people usually did. Instead, something deep inside him shifted with sudden force. Not pity, not impulse, recognition. Without another moment of hesitation, Silas turned toward the bakery door, reached for the handle, and stepped into the warm golden light. The bell above the door chimed softly as Silas Vale stepped into Velvet Crumb Bakery. Warmth wrapped around him immediately, vanilla butter and caramelized sugar drifting through the air like a memory. Inside, the world felt calm and golden, far removed from the cold sidewalk outside. Behind the counter, a young manager looked up. Her posture straightened instantly when she recognized him. "Mr. Vale," she said politely. Silas gave a brief nod but did not waste time with introductions. His eyes were already scanning the display case, searching quickly among the flawless cakes lined up like art pieces. Then he saw it. A tall, three-tier cake wrapped in smooth ivory buttercream, decorated with delicate blush roses and tiny hand-piped stars around each layer. Elegant. Perfect. Too perfect for an ordinary birthday. "That one," Silas said calmly, pointing toward it. The manager followed his gaze and froze. "Sir, that cake is reserved," she said carefully. "It's for a wedding tomorrow morning. We've spent 3 days preparing it." Silas nodded once. He had heard her. "I understand," he replied. "I need it tonight." The manager shifted uncomfortably. "We can make another cake quickly. A smaller one. Something simple. I need candles, too," Silas added quietly. 8. The number hung in the air heavier than it should have. For a moment, the entire bakery seemed to pause. Even the hum of the refrigerator behind the counter sounded louder. "Mr. Vale," the manager said again, lowering her voice, "that cake can't be replaced overnight." Silas reached into his coat and placed his credit card on the counter, sliding it forward with steady hands. "I'll pay for the cake," he said. "And the replacement? And overtime for your staff. Whatever it costs." He looked through the window toward the sidewalk outside. "I just need that one tonight." The manager hesitated, then slowly nodded. "Give us 5 minutes," she said. And in that moment, a cake meant for a wedding began quietly changing the direction of 2 lives. 5 minutes later, Silas Vale stepped back out into the cool evening, carrying a large white bakery box with both hands. The rain had slowed to a thin mist, and the streetlights reflected softly on the wet pavement. Down the sidewalk, Leora and Maren were already walking away. Silas quickened his pace. "Excuse me," he called gently. "Please wait." Maren turned instantly, pulling Leora slightly behind her, with a protective reflex that had been learned the hard way. When she saw the tall man approaching with the bakery box, suspicion tightened her expression. Silas noticed immediately. He slowed down and stopped several feet away so he wouldn't appear threatening. "I'm sorry," he said calmly. "I didn't mean to scare you." Maren's eyes moved from his face to the white box in his hands. "What is this?" she asked cautiously. Silas glanced at Leora before answering. "I was standing behind you at the bakery," he said. "I heard what your daughter said." Maren's jaw tightened, slightly embarrassed. "You didn't have to." He gently extended the box forward. "This is for her," he said. Leora's eyes widened. "For me," she whispered. Silas nodded. "Happy birthday." For a moment, no one moved. The bakery lights behind him cast a warm glow over the scene, making the box look almost unreal in his hands. Maren shook her head slowly. "We can't accept that," she said firmly. "We don't even know you." "That's okay," Silas replied softly. Her eyes narrowed. "Then why would you do this?" Silas hesitated for only a second before answering honestly. "When I was her age," he said quietly, "someone did the same thing for me." The street fell silent around them. Silas held the box steady. "I can't change everything," he added gently. "But tonight, I can change this moment." Leora looked up at her mother with hopeful eyes, and Maren realized she was about to make a decision that might change their lives forever. For several seconds, Maren said nothing. She looked at the bakery box in the stranger's hands, then down at Leora, whose eyes shone with a mixture of wonder and disbelief. The child was trying very hard not to look too hopeful, but hope had already filled her entire face. Maren felt pride and gratitude collide painfully inside her chest. "We really can't afford to owe anyone," she said quietly. Silas nodded with understanding. "You won't," he replied. "It's not a loan, and it's not charity either." Maren crossed her arms slightly. Then what is it? Silas gave a small, thoughtful smile. Think of it as a birthday gift, he said, from someone who remembers what it feels like when life is hard. The honesty in his voice made it difficult to argue. Leora tugged gently on her mother's sleeve. Mom. Please, Maren closed her eyes for a moment. When she opened them again, the resistance in her expression softened just enough. All right, she said quietly. Just this once. Leora gasped softly. Silas carefully handed her the box, but the cake was almost as large as her torso. She struggled to hold it, laughing nervously as it tilted. Maybe I should carry it, Silas said, smiling slightly. He gestured toward the street corner. My car is just over there, he added. If you'd like, I can drive you home. It's a big cake. I'd hate for it to fall before the candles are lit. Maren stiffened immediately. Silas noticed and raised his hands slightly in reassurance. You can sit in the back with her, he said calmly. Take a photo of my license plate if that makes you feel safer. No detours. Maren studied him carefully. Then she nodded. 6 blocks, she said. Silas opened the car door for them, and for the first time that evening, Leora began to believe this birthday might actually be real. The drive was quiet. Rain slid softly across the windshield as Silas steered through the narrow streets of Ashbourne. In the back seat, Leora sat beside her mother, both hands resting carefully on the large bakery box, as if it contained something fragile enough to disappear. Her eyes never left it. Every few seconds, she glanced up just to make sure it was still real. Silas noticed through the mirror and felt an unexpected warmth rise in his chest. What kind of books do you like? He asked suddenly. Leora looked up, surprised. Mystery books, she said quickly, and adventure stories. The ones where kids find secret doors or hidden maps. Silas nodded thoughtfully. Those are good ones. Maren watched the exchange in silence. Something about the way he spoke to Leora, calm, respectful, without the exaggerated cheer adults often used with children, made her feel slightly less guarded. A few minutes later, the car slowed beside an aging brick apartment building. This is us, Maren said quietly. The sign above the entrance read, Riverstone Court, though several letters had faded with time. Silas stepped out first and carefully lifted the cake box from the seat. Inside, the stairwell smelled faintly of laundry detergent and old paint. The narrow steps creaked under their weight as they climbed to the 3rd floor. When Maren opened the door to apartment 3B, warm yellow light spilled into the hallway. The apartment was small, barely more than one combined living room and kitchen, but everything inside was neat and carefully arranged. A worn couch sat against the wall, and children's drawings were taped above a small shelf filled with library books. Silas paused for a moment, taking it in. It's small, Maren said apologetically. Silas shook his head gently. It's home, he replied. Leora hurried to the kitchen table, clearing space with quick excitement. Can we open it now? She asked breathlessly. Silas placed the box gently on the table. Yes, he said with a small smile. I think it's time. Leora stood on her tiptoes beside the small kitchen table as Silas carefully lifted the lid of the bakery box. For a moment, nobody spoke. The cake seemed almost too beautiful for the room. Smooth ivory frosting curled into delicate patterns along the sides, and tiny blush-colored sugar flowers rested on the top layer like something from a dream. Under the soft kitchen light, it looked impossibly elegant against the worn table surface. Leora gasped. Her hands flew to her mouth as her eyes widened with disbelief. It's huge, she whispered. Maren let out a shaky laugh that sounded half like a sob. I don't think I've ever seen a cake like that before. Silas opened the small packet from the bakery and placed the candles carefully on the table. 8 candles, he said quietly. Maren reached for a drawer and pulled out a box of matches. Her hands trembled slightly as she placed each candle gently into the frosting. 1, 2, 3. By the time she reached the 8th candle, her vision had blurred with tears. Silas struck the match and held it steady while she lit each small wick. One by one, the flames flickered to life, tiny golden lights dancing in the dim kitchen. For a brief moment, the little apartment seemed brighter than any ballroom. Maren cleared her throat. Then she began to sing. Her voice was soft and a little uneven but full of warmth. Silas joined quietly after the first line, his deeper voice steady beside hers. Leora laughed nervously before joining them both, her voice light and happy as the flames reflected in her wide eyes. When the song ended, Leora leaned forward. "Make a wish," Maren whispered. Leora squeezed her eyes shut tightly, thinking as hard as she could. Then she blew. All 8 candles went out at once. For a heartbeat, the room went dark again, and then Leora burst into pure, unstoppable laughter. The laughter filled the small apartment, like sunlight breaking through clouds. For a few seconds, Leora simply stared at the cake, as if she was afraid the moment might suddenly disappear if she blinked too much. Then she looked at her mother, eyes glowing. "Can we cut it now?" she asked eagerly. Maren wiped the corners of her eyes and laughed softly. "Of course we can." Silas handed her the knife from the kitchen counter, and Maren carefully sliced through the soft layers. The blade slid easily through the frosting, revealing delicate pink and cream layers inside. Leora watched every movement like it was magic. When the first slice landed on her plate, she picked up her fork slowly and took a small bite. Then she froze. Her eyes widened. "It's the best cake ever," she declared with complete seriousness. Silas smiled. Maren leaned back in her chair, still watching her daughter with the kind of quiet relief that only parents understand. For the first time in a long while, the tight worry in her shoulders seemed to loosen. They ate together at the little kitchen table, the 3 of them talking softly. Silas asked Leora about school. She told him about her favorite subject, reading, and how she loved stories where brave kids solved mysteries or discovered hidden worlds. She talked about the small library near their building, and how the librarian sometimes let her stay a little longer after closing because she read so much. "I want to be a teacher someday," she said, between bites of cake. Maren looked at her with pride. "That's a wonderful dream," Silas said gently. Then he made the mistake adults always make. "What did you wish for?" he asked. Leora looked down at her plate for a moment. "You're not supposed to tell," Maren reminded him with a small smile. But Leora hesitated. Then she spoke quietly. "I wished my mom wouldn't be so tired anymore." The room suddenly fell very still. For a moment, no one spoke. The quiet that followed Leora's words settled gently over the small kitchen like falling snow. Maren lowered her eyes quickly, pretending to adjust the plates on the table. "Oh, sweetheart," she murmured, forcing a small laugh. "I'm not that tired." But Leora shook her head with serious determination. "You are," she said softly. "You work all the time. Even when you smile, you still look tired." The honesty of a child landed heavier than any accusation. Silas looked down at the table, suddenly aware of how carefully Leora had chosen her wish. Not toys, not clothes, not even another cake. She had wished for rest, for her mother. Maren reached across the table and squeezed Leora's hand. "I'm okay, baby," she whispered. "Really?" Leora nodded slowly, accepting the answer, even if she didn't fully believe it. To break the silence, Silas cleared his throat slightly. "Well," he said gently, "that was the fastest candle blowout I've ever seen." Leora giggled, and the tension eased again. They finished their cake together, talking about school and books and the funny things children notice about the world. For a while, the tiny apartment felt warm and safe, as if the outside world had paused just long enough to let happiness breathe. Eventually, Silas stood. "I should let you two enjoy the rest of your evening," he said. Maren walked him to the door. Her expression had softened, though uncertainty still lingered in her eyes. "You didn't have to do this," she said quietly. Silas gave a small nod. "I know." Leora hurried over and hugged him quickly before he could react. "Thank you for my birthday," she whispered. Silas smiled faintly. "Happy birthday, Leora." A few minutes later, he stepped out into the cool night air. But he didn't start his car right away. Instead, he sat quietly in the driver's seat thinking about a little girl's wish. Silas sat behind the wheel of his car with the engine still off. The street outside Riverstone Court was quiet now. A single porch light flickered above the entrance, and somewhere down the block, a dog barked once before the neighborhood returned to silence. Inside the apartment above him, Leora was probably finishing the last crumbs of her first real birthday cake. Silas leaned back in the seat and closed his eyes for a moment. He could still hear her voice. "I wished my mom wouldn't be so tired anymore." It wasn't a child's wish. It was the kind of wish children make when they've already learned how heavy the world can be. Silas stared at the dark building in front of him. He had built companies worth billions, created systems that moved entire industries, and negotiated deals that changed the futures of thousands of employees. And yet tonight, the most powerful thing he had heard was a little girl asking for her mother to rest. He reached for his phone. His chief of staff, Adrian Cross, answered almost immediately. "You vanished from dinner," Adrian said. "Your sister's been calling. I need you to do something." Silas interrupted calmly. The tone in his voice erased any complaint. Adrian grew quiet. "What kind of something?" Silas glanced up toward the third-floor window where a faint kitchen light still glowed. "Find out everything you can about a woman named Maren Wren," he said. "Employment history, rent situation, skills, transportation issues." Quietly. There was a pause on the other end. "Is this personal?" Adrian asked carefully. "Yes," Silas replied. Another pause. "All right," Adrian said. "What are we doing once we know?" Silas spoke slowly, already seeing the plan forming in his mind. "Pay her rent for a year through a trust," he said. "Anonymous, no publicity, no connection to me." "Done. Repair the apartment if it needs work." "Understood." Silas hesitated briefly before adding the most important piece. "And look for a real job opportunity inside the company," he continued. "Something stable, normal hours, benefits, but it has to be legitimate. No charity positions." Adrian let out a quiet breath. "You're serious?" Silas looked back at the apartment window. "She deserves a chance," he said. Then he ended the call. For a long moment he stayed in the car watching the building in silence. He had bought a cake tonight. But now he understood something clearly. The cake had never been the real gift. The next morning began like every other morning in Maren Wren's life, too early and already heavy. The small kitchen of apartment 3B smelled faintly of toast and coffee. Sunlight pushed weakly through the narrow window above the sink, while Leora sat at the table finishing the last small slice of birthday cake she had carefully saved from the night before. She ate slowly, savoring every bite. Maren watched her with a tired smile while packing a simple lunch into Leora's school bag. "Best birthday ever?" Maren asked. Leora nodded enthusiastically, frosting still faintly visible on the corner of her mouth. "Best birthday ever." Maren laughed softly. For the first time in months, the sound came easily. Then her phone rang. The screen displayed an unfamiliar number. Maren hesitated before answering. "Hello, good morning, Ms. Wren," a professional voice said. "This is Riverstone Court Management." Maren's stomach dropped instantly. Late rent notices had never begun with friendly calls. "Yes," she said carefully. "I'm calling to inform you that your rent has been paid in full for the next 12 months, the man continued. Maren blinked. "I'm sorry." "What your lease balance has been cleared by an anonymous donor," he repeated. "Additionally, repairs to your apartment have been approved. The bathroom leak, the broken stair rail, and installation of a cooling unit." For several seconds, Maren couldn't speak. Her hand began to tremble slightly as she gripped the phone. That must be a mistake, she whispered. No mistake, the man replied calmly. Everything has already been processed. Across the table, Leora watched her mother's expression change. Mom, she asked softly. Maren covered the phone for a moment. Her eyes had filled with tears. No, sweetheart, she said quickly. We're not in trouble. She returned to the call, still stunned. Who did this? She asked quietly. I'm afraid the donor requested to remain anonymous, the manager replied. When the call ended, Maren sat down slowly in the nearest chair. Leora slid off her seat and walked over. Was it him? She asked. Maren didn't answer right away. Instead, she looked at the last slice of birthday cake sitting on the table and thought about the quiet man who had carried it into their lives the night before. Finally, she nodded faintly. I think so. Leora smiled softly, and somewhere across the city, Silas Vale was already beginning the next step of a plan that would quietly reshape their future. A week passed. Life in apartment 3B began to feel strangely lighter, though Maren still woke each morning half expecting the miracle to unravel. The rent was paid. Maintenance had already fixed the dripping bathroom pipe. Even the stair rail outside their door had been replaced. But Maren still moved carefully, as if sudden hope might shatter if handled too roughly. Then another envelope arrived. It was thicker than ordinary mail and printed on heavy cream paper. Maren found it tucked among grocery ads and overdue utility notices in the building's small metal mailbox. She almost ignored it. But something about the envelope felt different. When she opened it at the kitchen table that evening, Leora was sitting nearby finishing her homework. The letterhead at the top made Maren freeze. Vale Meridian Systems. Her heart began beating faster as she read. The document was a formal job offer. Operations Support Coordinator, full-time position, health insurance, stable hours, paid training. The salary listed at the bottom made Maren inhale sharply. It was more than she earned working 3 different jobs combined. I didn't apply for this, she whispered. Leora looked up immediately. Is it bad? Maren shook her head slowly, still staring at the letter. No, she said, voice trembling slightly. It's very good. Attached was a short note, explaining that her previous experience managing difficult customers, organizing schedules, handling high-pressure environments, made her a strong candidate for the role. To Maren, it felt surreal. All the things that had exhausted her for years, double shifts rushing between jobs, solving problems every hour, were suddenly being described as valuable skills. She read the letter again, more carefully this time. Then she sat down. Mom, Leora asked. Maren looked at her daughter and smiled through unexpected tears. I think someone is giving us a chance, she said softly. The next morning she called the number listed on the letter. The interview process was short. The hiring manager spoke respectfully, asked practical questions, and treated Maren like someone who already belonged there. By the end of the conversation, the job was hers if she wanted it. When Maren hung up the phone, her hands were shaking again. Across town, Silas Vale stood in his office, looking out at the city skyline as his assistant finished the report. She accepted the interview, Adrian said. Silas nodded once. Good. Then he returned to work. But for the first time in a long while, the numbers on his screen felt a little less empty. The morning of Maren Wren's first day at Vale Meridian Systems arrived faster than she expected. She stood in front of the small bathroom mirror in apartment 3B, adjusting the sleeves of a navy blazer she had bought from a thrift shop 2 days earlier. The fabric was slightly loose at the shoulders, but she had carefully stitched the seams the night before so it would sit better. Behind her, the tiny bathroom fan hummed softly. Maren studied her reflection. For years, her mornings had begun in uniforms that smelled like grease detergent or industrial cleaner, aprons, rubber gloves, shoes meant to survive long hours on hard floors. This was different. Today, she looked professional. The word felt strange in her mind. Mom Leora appeared in the doorway already dressed for school with her backpack slung over one shoulder. She looked her mother up and down, eyes wide with admiration. "You look like the boss," Leora declared proudly. Marin laughed nervously. "I definitely am not the boss, but you look like one." Marin crouched slightly so they were at the same level. "I'm probably going to be the most confused person in the entire building today," she admitted. Leora shrugged with the calm logic only children possess. "That's okay," she said. "You learn fast." Those simple words gave Marin more courage than she expected. A few minutes later, they stepped outside together. The early morning air was cool and bright, and the city was just beginning to wake up. Cars rolled down the street, commuters hurried along sidewalks, and the world felt unusually full of possibility. At the bus stop, Leora hugged her mother tightly. "You're going to do great," she said. Marin kissed the top of her daughter's head. "I'll see you after school." As the bus pulled away, Marin stood there for a moment, watching it disappear down the street. Then she turned and headed toward the train station. Across the city, the glass tower of Vale Meridian Systems rose above the skyline like a monument to precision and ambition. Inside the building, employees moved quickly through bright hallways carrying tablets, coffee cups, and conversations about data deadlines and strategies. When Marin stepped through the revolving doors, she felt the same nervous flutter return to her chest. Everything inside seemed spotless and organized: marble floors, polished metal railings, wide windows that flooded the lobby with natural light. A receptionist greeted her immediately. "Good morning, Ms. Wren. Welcome." The fact that someone already knew her name startled her. Moments later, her supervisor, Dana Keller, arrived to meet her. Dana was efficient, confident, and surprisingly warm. "We're glad you're here," she said. "Your background managing high-pressure service work will translate well to this role." For the next few hours, Marin learned the basics of the job: coordinating schedules, handling operational requests, managing customer support tickets. To her surprise, much of it felt familiar. Years of juggling multiple restaurant shifts, supply orders, and demanding customers had quietly built the exact skills this job required. By lunchtime, her nerves had eased. She realized something remarkable. She wasn't pretending to belong. She actually could do this. High above the office floors, Silas Vale stood in his glass-walled office overlooking Ashbourne. His assistant stepped in briefly. "She started this morning," Adrian said. Silas didn't turn from the window. "How is she doing?" Adrian checked his tablet. "According to the supervisor, very well." Silas allowed himself a small, quiet nod. Then he returned to work, knowing that somewhere below him, a woman who had spent years surviving was finally being given the chance to build something steadier. And the ripple from one small birthday wish continued to spread. The first few weeks at Vale Meridian Systems were exhausting for Marin, but in a completely different way than the jobs she had known before. Instead of running between tables, lifting heavy trays, or scrubbing kitchen floors late into the night, she spent her days learning systems, software dashboards, scheduling platforms, internal communications, customer response protocols. At first it felt overwhelming, but Marin had spent years solving problems under pressure. In the diner, mistakes meant angry customers. In cleaning jobs, delays meant losing hours of pay. Survival had trained her mind to move quickly. By the second week, her supervisor, Dana Keller, noticed something. Marin didn't panic when problems appeared. She solved them. One afternoon, a shipment delay threatened to disrupt a client project timeline. Several newer employees struggled to reorganize the schedule. Marin quietly studied the situation for 10 minutes, then rearranged the support tasks in a way that saved nearly half a day. Dana watched from across the office. Later, she leaned over Marin's desk. "Where did you learn to think like that?" Dana asked. Marin hesitated before answering. "Restaurants," she said simply. Dana laughed softly. "That explains it. Restaurant managers could probably run half the corporate world if someone gave them the chance." For the first time since she started, Maren smiled without uncertainty. Life at home was changing too. The repaired apartment felt brighter now. The broken stair rail outside had been replaced. The bathroom no longer smelled like damp pipes. Even the new cooling unit in the window made summer evenings easier. More than anything, Maren had something she had not experienced in years: predictability. She left work at the same time every evening. She ate dinner with Leora almost every night. They talked at the kitchen table about school books and the strange things that happened in offices filled with computers and meetings. One evening, Leora was working on a reading assignment while Maren prepared dinner. "Mom," Leora said suddenly. "Yes, you smile more now." Maren paused. "Do I?" Leora nodded. "You used to look tired all the time." The words were gentle, but they carried truth. Maren walked over and brushed Leora's hair back from her forehead. "I'm still tired sometimes," she said softly. "But not the same kind of tired." Leora thought about that for a moment. Then she returned to her book with a small, satisfied smile. Across the city, Silas Vale reviewed a weekly operations report on his tablet. Most of the document was routine business data, project timelines, performance charts, staffing updates. But one line near the bottom caught his attention. "New hire performance review. Maren Wren exceeds expectations in problem resolution and communication efficiency." Silas read the line twice. He felt something close to relief. He had worried about this part. It would have been easy to give someone help that didn't actually help, to place them in a role they weren't prepared for. But Maren had done exactly what he suspected she would. She had taken the opportunity and earned it. Silas set the tablet down and looked out the window at the sprawling city below. Thousands of lives moved through those streets every hour, most of them unseen, most of them struggling quietly. He remembered a small girl standing outside a bakery window, and for the first time in years, the success of his company felt connected to something larger than profit. It felt like responsibility. While Maren's life slowly stabilized, another transformation was happening quietly inside Leora. Before that birthday night outside Velvet Crumb, Leora had always been a bright child, but cautious. She read constantly, but often kept her thoughts to herself. Years of watching her mother struggle had taught her something children should never have to learn: don't ask for too much. But as the months passed and their life became steadier, something inside her began to open. At school, her teachers noticed it first. Leora started volunteering answers more often during reading discussions. She helped other students understand difficult stories. When the class was assigned short essays, her writing stood out not because it was flashy, but because it carried unusual emotional depth for someone her age. One afternoon, her teacher, Mrs. Holloway, called her to the desk after class. "You write like someone who pays attention to people," the teacher said gently. Leora shifted her backpack nervously. "Is that bad?" Mrs. Holloway smiled. "No, it's rare." That day, Leora walked home thinking about those words. Pays attention to people. Maybe that was true. After all, she had spent years noticing small things most children ignored: when her mother was too tired to sit down, when someone at school skipped lunch, when the librarian looked lonely on slow afternoons. Soon, Leora began staying later at the community library after school. The librarian, Mrs. Carver, didn't mind. "You read faster than most adults," she once joked. Leora grinned shyly. Books are easier than people sometimes. But people fascinated her too. She began helping younger kids pick out books, explaining stories to them the way Mrs. Holloway explained them to the class. Slowly, she discovered something surprising. She liked helping others understand things. It made her feel useful. At home, Maren noticed the change. One evening, she found Leora sitting on the couch, surrounded by 3 younger children from the building, reading aloud from an adventure novel. The kids listened, wide-eyed. When the chapter ended, one of them asked eagerly, "What happens next?" Leora smiled. "You'll have to come back tomorrow to find out." After the children left, Maren sat beside her daughter. "You're good at that," she said. "Reading." No, Maren replied softly. "Teaching." Leora blinked. She had never thought about it that way before. "Do you think I could be a teacher someday?" she asked. Maren didn't hesitate. "I think you could be an amazing one." Across the city, Silas Vale was reviewing reports from the foundation programs his company quietly funded. One line caught his attention. Community literacy participation student volunteer Leora Wren Silas leaned back slightly in his chair. He had not intended to follow her life so closely. But the systems he built produced information naturally, like ripples spreading through water. The note explained that Leora had begun helping younger children read at the community library. Silas stared at the screen for a moment. Then he closed the file. Some stories he knew were better watched from a distance. Because what mattered most now was not the help he had given years ago. It was what Leora was choosing to do with it. 10 years passed more quickly than anyone expected. Life did not transform overnight. It never does. Instead, it changed in quiet layers, small improvements, stacking slowly, until one day the past felt like a distant landscape. By the time Leora Wren turned 18, the little girl who once stood outside a bakery window had grown into a thoughtful, confident young woman. She was taller now, with the same observant eyes that noticed things other people overlooked. But the sadness that once lived in them had been replaced by something steadier. Purpose. Leora spent much of her time volunteering at the West Hollow Youth Center, a place where children from struggling families came after school for tutoring and activities. She helped them with reading. Some of the younger kids reminded her of herself, quiet, cautious, afraid of asking questions because they didn't want to appear slow or needy. Leora understood that feeling better than anyone. "Take your time," she would tell them gently when they struggled through a sentence. "We're not in a hurry." The kids trusted her quickly. She never made them feel small. At home, Maren's life had changed too. Her position at Vale Meridian Systems had grown into a stable career. After several years of consistent performance, she had been promoted twice. She now supervised a small operations team and was known inside the company for her calm decision-making during high-pressure situations. For the first time in her adult life, Maren could plan ahead. Bills were paid on time. There was food in the refrigerator every week. They had even moved into a modest duplex with a tiny yard in front. Leora insisted on calling it our lawn. Some evenings, Maren would sit on the small porch after work, watching the sunset with quiet disbelief. Life had not become perfect, but it had become possible. Across town, Silas Vale had followed these changes only through distant updates. Every few months, his assistant Adrian provided brief summaries connected to the company's community programs, scholarships, mentorship initiatives, literacy support. Leora's name appeared occasionally. Top academic performance, volunteer leadership, scholarship recipient. Silas never reached out directly. That had always been part of the promise he made to himself. Help quietly. Step away. Let people build their own lives without feeling observed or indebted. Still one evening, he found himself standing at the window of his penthouse office, staring out at the lights of Ashbourne. He thought about the night outside the bakery. A child's whisper. 8 candles. A wish made not for herself. Silas had built billion-dollar companies. He had reshaped entire industries. Yet somehow, the moment that stayed with him most clearly was still that small kitchen table, a birthday cake glowing under candlelight, and a little girl laughing as if the world had suddenly become kinder. Sometimes he realized the smallest choices carried the longest echoes. And somewhere in the city, Leora Wren was becoming the kind of person who would one day create those echoes for someone else. The reunion happened in the most ordinary way possible. It was early autumn in Ashbourne. Leaves drifted slowly along the sidewalks outside the West Hollow Youth Center, and the evening air carried the quiet chill that comes just before winter. Leora, now 19, stepped out of the center carrying a stack of reading workbooks under one arm. She had just finished helping a group of fourth graders practice reading aloud, and their excited voices still echoed faintly in her mind. She was halfway down the steps when a familiar black car pulled to the curb. At first, she didn't think anything of it. Then the door opened. The man who stepped out looked older than the one she remembered. His hair was touched with a little gray at the temples now, and the lines around his eyes had deepened slightly. But the calm posture was the same. So was the quiet presence that made the world seem to slow down around him. Leora stopped walking. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then she smiled. "You're the cake man." The words escaped before she could stop them. Silas Vale blinked once in surprise. Then he laughed softly. "I was wondering if you'd remember me." "I remember everything," Leora replied. They stood there awkwardly for a second, the years between them suddenly very visible. Silas picked up one of the workbooks that had slipped from her arm and handed it back to her. "You've grown," he said. Leora tilted her head playfully. "That usually happens over 10 years, Silas chuckled. They walked together to a bench near the entrance of the youth center. The evening sky had begun to fade into soft purple, and streetlights flickered on one by one. "I found out about the trust fund last year," Leora said after a moment. Silas looked down at his hands. "I hoped you wouldn't feel obligated," he replied quietly. "I don't," she said quickly. "I feel grateful." Silas nodded slowly. "That's all I ever wanted." They sat in silence for a few seconds. Finally, Leora turned toward him. "Why did you really help us?" she asked. Silas looked out toward the street where cars moved through pools of light. "Because," he said after a long pause, "someone once helped me in exactly the same way." Leora listened carefully. "When I was 8, Silas continued, my mother forgot my birthday. Not because she didn't care, because she was exhausted. A neighbor brought me a cake that night." He smiled faintly at the memory. "And I never forgot how that felt." Leora nodded slowly. Then she stepped forward and hugged him. It was quick, sincere, and completely unexpected. "Thank you," she whispered. Silas stood very still for a moment before gently returning the hug. And in that quiet autumn evening, the story that had begun with a birthday cake finally came full circle. The years moved forward quickly after that evening. Leora Wren graduated high school with honors and accepted a scholarship to study education at Ashbourne State University. When she left home for the first semester, her suitcase held more books than clothes. "You're taking half the library with you," Marin joked as she helped load the car. "Just the important ones," Leora replied. College changed her in ways that were quiet, but powerful. She studied child development, literacy education, and community outreach programs. But more than anything, she paid attention to the students who struggled the most. They reminded her of children she had once known, children who hid hunger behind smiles, children who avoided raising their hands because they feared being wrong. Leora never forgot that feeling. During her second year, she volunteered in several public schools across Ashbourne, helping younger students improve their reading skills. Teachers quickly noticed that she had a special ability. Children trusted her. They listened to her. And they tried harder when she was around. Meanwhile, Marin's life continued to stabilize. Her career at Vale Meridian Systems had grown steadily. She now managed an entire support division and had earned a reputation inside the company as someone who solved problems with calm efficiency. But despite the promotions, Marin never forgot where her life had turned. Sometimes she would sit at the kitchen table late at night, remembering a rainy evening and a stranger carrying a cake into their tiny apartment. More than once, she tried to contact Silas Vale through the company, hoping to thank him properly. But the messages were never returned. Not because he ignored them, because he believed the best help left room for independence. 4 years later, on a bright spring morning, Leora stood on the stage of Ashbourne State University's graduation ceremony. Hundreds of students sat in rows wearing black gowns and square caps. Families filled the audience, cameras, ready voices buzzing with excitement. Maren sat in the crowd, gripping the program tightly. Beside her sat a familiar figure in a dark suit. Silas had arrived quietly before the ceremony began. When Leora's name was called, she walked across the stage, confidently accepting her diploma with a steady smile. Later, during the student speech, she stepped to the microphone. The large hall slowly grew quiet. When I was 8 years old, Leora began, I stood outside a bakery on my birthday and believed something very small, that not having a cake meant I didn't matter. Soft laughter moved through the audience, but that night she continued. A stranger heard me and stopped walking. She glanced briefly toward the audience where Maren and Silas sat. That moment didn't magically fix our lives, but it changed the direction of them. It reminded my mother and me that kindness from one person can echo for years. Maren squeezed Silas's hand gently. "You changed everything," she whispered through tears. Silas shook his head. "No," he said quietly, watching Leora smiling under the stage lights. "She did." After graduation, Leora Wren accepted a teaching position at a public elementary school on the west side of Ashbourne. The building was old. The paint near the windows had begun to chip, and some of the desks had been repaired so many times they barely looked like the same furniture anymore. But when Leora stepped into her classroom for the first time, sunlight poured through the tall windows and filled the room with warmth. She smiled. It wasn't perfect, but it was exactly where she wanted to be. Leora spent the next few weeks preparing everything carefully. She built a small classroom library with donated books. She placed colorful posters on the walls. She arranged reading corners with soft cushions so students could sit comfortably while reading. Most importantly, she paid attention. She noticed the children who arrived early because their homes were too noisy to study. She noticed the students who struggled quietly, afraid to ask for help. And she noticed the kids who pretended they didn't care about school at all. Those were the ones who needed the most patience. One afternoon, a young boy stayed after class while the other students left. "Miss Wren," he asked quietly. "Yes, why do you help us so much?" Leora paused for a moment. Then she knelt beside his desk. "Because someone once helped me," she said gently. The boy considered that answer carefully. Across the city, Silas Vale read one of the quiet reports from the education foundation his company supported. It mentioned improved reading scores in Leora's class and higher attendance among her students. Silas closed the report slowly. He looked out across the city skyline and allowed himself a small smile. He had built companies worth billions. But the return on investment he valued most was happening inside a small classroom filled with sunlight and children learning to believe in themselves. Several years later, Leora met Silas Vale again. It happened on a quiet afternoon outside her school. Classes had just ended, and children were rushing toward waiting parents while teachers closed classroom doors for the day. Leora stepped outside carrying a stack of papers when she noticed a familiar figure standing near the gate. Silas looked older now. His hair had turned more silver, but the calm expression on his face was the same. "Silas," she said, surprised but smiling. "I was in the neighborhood," he replied. They walked slowly along the sidewalk beside the school. "I heard you're moving," Leora said. Silas nodded. "Retirement. New leadership at the company." She stopped for a moment. "You built a lot of things," she said. Silas looked toward the school building where children's voices still echoed faintly inside. "The most important one," he said quietly, "started with a cake." Leora laughed softly. "That cake changed my life." Silas shook his head gently. "No," he replied. "You changed it." They stood there for a moment in comfortable silence. Then Leora stepped forward and hugged him again. "Thank you for stopping that night," she said. Silas smiled. "Thank you for what you did with it." Years later, Leora Wren stood alone in her classroom on the last day of the school year. Sunlight streamed through the tall windows, illuminating the drawings her students had taped to the walls, bright suns, crooked houses, stick figures holding hands. On her desk sat a small wooden box she had carried with her through every chapter of her life. Inside were three simple things. Her first library card, a faded photo of her and her mother in their old apartment, and a single cream-colored candle saved from a birthday cake long ago. Leora picked up the candle and smiled softly. That small moment from her childhood had traveled further than anyone could have imagined. Across the city that same evening, a little girl stood outside a bakery window, staring at rows of glowing cakes inside. Beside her stood a tired mother. People passed by on the sidewalk without noticing, but one person slowed down, then stopped. And somewhere far away, Silas Vale sat quietly on a porch, watching the sunset with the bent candle resting beside him. Because real wealth, he had learned, was never about what you keep. It was about the moment you choose to see someone else. Did this story move your soul? Share your feelings in the comments and rate it from 1 to 10. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe, then tap the bell icon so you never miss a new story. Click the end screen to watch another heartfelt video. See you in the next story.